Yeah,
Okay, welcome everybody to the ITS Davis Transportation and Technology and Policy Seminar. Our guest today is Janet Azarian, who's a Senior Mobility Strategist and Principal at the Smith Group. I'm just going to say a couple small things about Janet because she's actually got some biographical slides at the beginning. I met Janet when she was at City of Chicago, and we were talking, a pavement guy, and we were talking, she was working on permeable pavement. And so we got to talking, but many common interests, a Renaissance woman to some degree, many interests, which she actually manages to connect the dots on, probably than most folks that I know. Janet's had over 20 years experience in creating beautiful, livable cities, focusing on neighborhood placemaking, transportation, and sustainable design. She's worked for City of Chicago, City of Detroit, probably some other places she's going to tell about us, and now in the private sector. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you.
Well, hello everyone. I'm delighted to be here. It's a great crowd. I would really like to do this talk where you guys feel comfortable interrupting me and asking questions. We will also have time at the end too, I'm sure. But please feel free. I know that can be daunting, especially with someone like me, because I'll just go. So don't be shy. Raise your hand, wave it around, speak up. It's okay. This is a bit of a dialogue. In fact, I will be honest with you. This talk has been a little bit of me pulling together some new ideas that I have. So it's not a polished thing yet. It's a work in progress. And so I'm very interested in actually, hearing what you think about it. If you've got some ideas around some of the things I'm going to be talking about, don't be shy to bring it up. I'm covering a very sort of big brush in some ways, but I'm also going to try to bring it home for you a little bit in terms of just stuff that I've done, and so you can kind of see how it's sort of playing out in some real cities, and we'll sort of go from there. So as John mentioned, I put just 3 slides about myself, and the reason I did this is really not so much to talk about me as it is I do want you to have a little bit of an understanding of sort of where what comes after comes from, because I think it's important, right? There's so many different angles that you can look at this stuff from. There's so many ways sort of you can talk about it, you can think about it. But this, I think, really is something that comes for me out of really, at this point, almost 30 years of experience of sort of working for cities. Some private sector, actually, even before all of this, but I think what's really important is that I was the Complete Streets Director for the City of Chicago for 20 years. So I really got to see Chicago go from a city where at 5 o'clock at night, and there was nobody down there and it was dead, to a world-class city that plays on the global stage. And really be there to sort of help figure out how to make that happen from I think a little bit of the infrastructure and mobility and transportation perspective. So that I think is just the first thing, right? I've had this big block of sort of public experience. I had a long time working at a DOT in a major city. I then went from there and left and became the deputy director for the planning department for the city of Detroit. I think this is important because that's not a typical career path. That would be considered a pretty kind of sort of a little bit off the center. But for me, it made a lot of sense for a lot of things. One is that I've always been very sort of entrepreneurial in the way I sort of approach my work. And one of the reasons I was able to stay at CDOT for 20 years was because I was given a lot of leeway to be quite entrepreneurial within the space. And when the opportunity came in Detroit, it was actually to build a planning department from scratch. So essentially, we were going to be a startup within a government agency, which was almost in itself being a whole startup because Detroit was coming out of its bankruptcy. So the whole thing was actually incredibly sort of entrepreneurial, but it was also still the cities and government, which was something I loved, and it came together. Also, after 20 years in Chicago of actually building stuff and doing some policy work, I had kind of gotten to that point where I was like, we got to do some big moves. Like, I keep doing this stuff, but I can't. I was able to make changes like within the department, even within the city of Chicago, but there were bigger changes that needed to be made. And I was trying to figure out how do I do that? How do I get myself into a position? And also then too, how do I understand transportation in a larger context, right? Because what you do also realize after spending 20 years of doing it within the city is that, you know, it's an ecosystem, right? And nothing lives by itself. And so it was a very unique opportunity. And also, quite frankly, having grown up right outside of Detroit, I'd always sort of kept my eye on it. And I quite frankly wanted to prove to folks that a majority minority city could be just as wonderful as any other city. And if you know the story of Detroit, there's a lot in that story. So, and then really only today officially, I think, is my 6-month anniversary in private practice. And so part of the reason I sort of stepped out of the public sector was one of the things that did begin to frustrate me was I was like, there's amazing things happening. I'm helping make amazing things happen, but there's big misses we're making. There are things that are not happening within government right now, in my opinion, at the speed that they need to happen. The dots aren't all being connected. It's not that there are good people doing good things, there are, but that we need tools that government doesn't have right now to help them be able to make different decisions on the engineering side and on the policy side. And I sort of felt after, getting close to 30 years of experience, that maybe this was something that I needed to help bring to more than just one city. So that just gives you sort of a little bit of perspective on where this sort of talk sort of comes from. So bear with me as we go through it. I'm going to do a little pontificating. I'm going to be doing a little bit of prodding. I'm going to be doing a little like questioning, and then a little bit of sort of trying to bring it home to some reality. So I'd like to start by saying we're failing. It's not necessarily the greatest place to start, but we really are. And I think we have to get our hands around this because I've spent my whole life doing this stuff. So when I say we're failing, I could say I failed. I don't think I did in the complete sense of that term. I think we did a lot of really, really great stuff, but all the work that we've done, all the progress that we've made, all the conversations, the policies, the different types of projects, the seminars, our roads are actually still terribly unsafe. They're becoming less safe. Pedestrian deaths are up in this country. There's more congestion. It's not like we've figured out the congestion problem. It just keeps getting worse. Engineers keep designing roads basically the same way they did 50 years ago, and it's based on endless growth in single occupancy vehicles. The transportation sector has become the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not like we're really winning the sustainability battle here. We're not. The power industry's, done a good job, and now transportation's #1. And we're just not able to keep up, right? I mean, we all hear the statistic. How many billions of dollars do we need to just maintain what we have, never mind build what we need? So this is not a good place to be. I think this is a moment where we have to say, what are we not doing? Because we've been trying. And people are on board. Like when I listen to stuff that I used to say 10, 15 years ago, now I go to conferences and like everyone's saying it and I'm like, this is cool. This is like why we were saying it. Like people are talking this stuff up, but it's still not translating. So what are we missing? Let's hope this all works. So add to that the fact that we now have things like climate, right? And the fact that we know that that's just changing the future in a way that we're not even sure what that is. We have big societal changes that are going on. We are becoming much more diverse. We're becoming more integrated. We're becoming more urban. We've got technology changes going on, right? I mean, in the mobility sector, it's just kind of amazing. You know, you have to work pretty much 24/7 just to try to keep up with it. And the truth is, what's most important about that technology stuff is, if you think you know what it's going to be, you're wrong. It's going to keep changing, right? And probably all the kinds of things we're talking about now, 10 years from now, we may be talking about a whole different set. So it's not just that there's new technology, that technology is changing at a rapid, very rapid pace. These are hard things for cities and engineers and others to actually deal with when it comes to, you know, the real world. And all of this, and the economic thing is an interesting thing, and I don't know quite right. It's a little bit of a chicken and an egg with the economic thing. I don't know if all of this is going to require huge economic change, or if economic change is sort of happening and it's sort of pushing these things up. It's probably a little bit of both. But there's going to need to be some fundamental restructuring of our economic system. And that does not happen well. As a species, we don't do that well. When we have to change economic systems, we tend to, like, you know, do wars and other really bad, nasty stuff. We don't deal with that well. So to me, this is not just like, ooh, this is kind of an issue problem. It's also, to me, I look at this and say, change has to happen. Change can happen with less harm, or change can happen with more harm. I really want to end up in this column over here. And we don't, it's hard for us. We do not do that well. So, all that being said, if we can't predict the future, we can determine what we want the outcome to be. So the way I like to describe that is, I know where I am today. If I can describe where I want to be sometime in the future, and everything in between is really, in a sense, completely unknown, right? It's going to be changing at some sort of rapid rate that I really can't define. Then what do I have to do given that situation, right? And how do I come up with some paths forward for cities given those that sort of situation? So if we don't want these types of outcomes, that, you know, people, sort of a more dystopic view of what could maybe happen with sort of mobility, you know, and where we are less connected, things are more expensive, you know, you've got less effective infrastructure, you know, more VMT, less safe, you know, less accessible, right? And we do want it to be something like this, where we've got things that are.
You did the opposite.
What? Oh, oh, I did. Sorry, in my mind. So yes, okay. So if we do want these types of outcomes, I was like wondering. I'm like not even looking at my pictures. I was just talking, and we don't want these types of outcomes. Then I believe what we need to do is come up with flexible design systems. Now, that's really easy to say. You know, what does that really mean? So they need to be more transparent, they need to be more porous, digitally enabled, data savvy, they need to be people first, they need to be plug and play ready, they need to be net zero. And I think this concept here at the bottom is, can they grow with us versus shape us? Now, I actually don't know that that's possible. Because again, it's a little bit chicken and egg, right? Everything is shaping us while we're growing. But it's this idea of sort of how do we start to think about the fact that can we be a little bit more in the control position versus a little bit less? Because I feel like, and I'll talk about this in a second, I feel like if you look back at the last 100 years, we sort of let our technology shape us a little bit too much. The other thing, of course, that this all means is that we can no longer use the data of the past to design for the future. And this is a problem, because engineering 101 is that you look at the past and you take, data and measurements and trends, and you base your designs and your thinking on that. So if the future is radically different than the past, then how does that work? It doesn't work for you, right? And so how do we begin to make this into something that, again, decision makers can rely on and have some comfort with? And we all know some of the things that are happening, right? Precipitation forecasts and heat changes and, extreme weather. What's interesting, of course, one of the benefits of my new job is that I have climate scientists who work with me now and economists who work with me now, and they are really good at some of this stuff. And you're sort of like, okay, well, there are people who are predicting data into the future. What does that mean? Because when I go and I design a highway, I can tell you that none of this stuff shows up. None of it. So I want to figure out how, when we're designing the next major freeway, that maybe some of this stuff actually does show up. And then, how do we balance this sort of data-rich analysis with, of course, the fact that what we want, again, defining those outcomes in the future, we really want things to be people-centric, right, and people first. So, we've actually been here before. It's really quite interesting to look back 100 years, and the car, was just becoming sort of king, and people had, again, some very utopian visions, actually, of the future. We wouldn't think of them as utopian now, but they thought they were pretty utopian then, and that it was going to make the world better in so many ways. And of course, the car has made life better in so many ways, in some ways. But it wasn't, there were a lot of unintended consequences in some of these dreams and these visions. We thought of autonomous cars a long time ago. It's really not that new. We even had electric scooters that actually existed. This is Amelia. Yes, on an electric scooter. So, that's another, I think, one of the things I tell new planners, and it's funny because people say that they say, you really say that to new planners? I say, yeah, I really say that to new planners. And I just hired a lot of them. I always say, look, the most important thing to remember as a planner is if 50 years from now people think one of your ideas is good, you're a great planner. Because chances are, most of them, people will look back and be like, what were they thinking, right? But what's also amazing is how this stuff does come up and it doesn't get adopted. And so, you hear now when people talk about, AV stuff, like it's just a foregone conclusion. But you just don't really actually know, because, we did have a lot of electric, not only back at this time, but, many things, of course, came up again in the 70s and, went away. It's not a linear process. It's a very messy process. So I have been asking myself a series of questions. And I'm going to kind of go through these with you. I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers to these questions, but they're questions I'm thinking about. And I'm going to try to share at least some of the things that I'm thinking about. But I think these are very important questions for this next decade. And we're going to have to really, maybe not fully answer them, but go up, big strides in answering them if we are going to have the kinds of outcomes that we want. And I think if we don't, we're going to be in serious trouble, not only ourselves, but obviously future generations. So, what does mobility as a service mean? So this is a term we hear a lot, right? Mobility as a service. The way I like to describe it to folks, and I'm sure there's a lot of you in this room who are like, I know what she's talking about. But there's a lot of people when you say that, they look at you like, the general public does not go around thinking about mobility as a service. Let me assure you, right? But I think of it as your cell phone, right? So your cell phone has become a service. Now at this point, we don't even really own them, right? We're on some sort of payment plan, and probably before the payment plan is even done, we'll be getting the next one, right? It's essentially, we're leasing it. It's buy to own, but essentially we're sort of in a lease situation, and we can buy different amounts of data. We can, buy different types of apps. We can make this thing work. So if you start to think of mobility that way, it really gets you to step away from this idea of ownership, which has been central essentially to car culture, right? It's really based on this idea that, the place you want to be, nirvana, is that you own a car, if not one, maybe multiple, right? And it's your personal automobile. You can do what you want in it. You can take it where you want to go, and all this type of stuff. But what if, of course, instead, you didn't buy a car, you bought a service? So one of the things that I've been thinking about and pushing the automakers to do, because they've been thinking about this too, a number of them, Ford certainly has been trying to figure this out. What does this mean if people maybe in the future aren't going to buy cars? Then what are we as a car company, and what are we going to sell, right? So it's an interesting question, and it's interesting to watch. In Detroit, we're watching this all very much firsthand as they sort of go through these contortions of trying to figure out what this means. But one of the things I've said to them is, look, you guys are really good at leasing. Like, this is something you do. Like, you got this down. Why are you only leasing a car? You should be leasing a whole, when I lease my car, I should get a bus pass that comes with it on a regular basis. I should get access to my bike share. I should, whatever. But I should get access to a whole bunch of different mobility choices. It's an interesting entry point for the American economy, right? Because people are used to doing that. More and more people are leasing cars because they want that new one, right? And a lot of folks might get a transit pass who would never have maybe taken transit otherwise, right? And you know what? Probably some of them maybe won't even take that transit ride, but some of them might, because they got a pass that's coming to them in the mail, and maybe with that pass comes some explanation, right? And some incentives and some benefits that come with it. And then, because now the car company is buying transit passes, they've worked out a deal, you'd have to have some regionality to get this, right? With the local region, where they're buying those bus passes, it's at a discounted rate because they're not sure if people are going to use it. But now that transit agency has a whole different revenue stream that they didn't have before. And so you've got some sort of public-private sort of happening. You're getting folks introduced to this idea that you are buying sort of a package of different mobility choices that are going to come along with your vehicle. You're maybe getting some new users into the system across different ways. So, I think this also gets into this idea of how the car is evolving, and quite frankly, in some ways, I almost like to say devolving, because what we're seeing, of course, is a whole range of mobility devices, right, between the car and the pedestrian. I think, which is quite interesting to see how these things are beginning to develop. Now, of course, many other parts of the world have had this for a long time. I think, you know, I fully admit that this talk is a little US centered. I mean, this is where I've sort of worked, but I am sort of aware that these things are sort of evolving differently. I mean, if you go to China, there's folks driving around all the time in 3-wheeled vehicles and 2-wheeled things and all combinations, and, you know, I mean, and they're doing it. And in fact, you know, slow lanes is something that really China's been doing for a really long time. So we talk about a lot of this stuff in the United States like it's a new thing, but other countries in some ways have been doing it and getting to it from a slightly different perspective, right? Obviously, it's not just about the car, it is all about these sort of other modes. And really what this all comes down to is choice, right? I'm not so sure if it should include this. Yes?
You said slow lane.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me what that is?
Yeah. So a slow lane is the idea of, why are we building a bike lane, for instance, when really what we need is a lane for people who go 0 to 20, let's just say, on any host of vehicles, right? So that it's not this idea that you've got, because otherwise we might have to have a car lane and a scooter lane and a bike lane and a, I don't know, a Segway lane and a, right? I mean, and it sounds silly, but I have been in public meetings where everybody wants to segregate everybody into their own little space, and you're like, there's just not enough public right of way in the world, right? And so how are we really thinking about the fact that it's not just the ped, bike, you know, vehicle transect? It's really right now, it's this really, to me, a speed transect. You know, do you go in this range and do you weigh this much? Or do you weigh this much and go in this speed range? Or do you weigh this much and go in this speed range, right? And that's really the issue, because it's really in the end driven by safety, not really the mode. I have a real problem with this. I hope this actually isn't part of our mobility as a service too much. I don't know, maybe it's my prejudice to designing cities, but it also actually is my prejudice in being a private vehicle. I actually, really think it will be incredibly obnoxious to have things flying over my head. I think from a regulatory perspective, it's going to be incredibly difficult, and from a privacy perspective, just think about it. Right now, you know, most of us maybe have our shades down during the day. I know at night, I even keep mine at 3/4. If there can be something that's like flying around all the time, if I want privacy, like I've now got to seal myself in like all 360-degree directions. You know, I don't know how I feel about that.
That's now.
Yes, well, it is true. It is now, right? I know. My next door neighbor, he has become, he's a 14-year-old boy, and he is got his own drone business. And I often think about the fact that I don't know what he's doing with those drones. But you know, at the end of the day, we've got to also make sure that it's not just about the vehicles, right? It's also about all these other things when we're really talking about mobility as service. It is about the infrastructure and how the infrastructure is supporting that. And I tried to weave in some of my own work in here to sort of, you know, give you some examples of how this stuff actually sort of translates into projects. Because one of the things about having these types of discussions, right, is it's really easy to sort of talk at this level, and I think it's important that we do. But in the real world, it translates into individual projects. That, you know, we don't build systems all at once. We don't make change all at once. It's all these little projects that have to add up to something bigger. So this is Millennium Park Bike Station. It's been built, it was built a little while ago in Chicago, but this was really this idea of really trying to provide, make mobility a service. And this idea that it, you know, it wasn't just good enough to say, you know, ride your bike to work, here's some bike lanes, but to say part of making this something that's really wonderful to do is to create a place that's beautiful, super convenient, 24-hour access for bicyclists to park in a safe place. There are actually showers, you can take a shower, there's towel service. You know, there's a place where you can get your bike fixed, there's storage, there's bike rental, there's bike valet, there's a coffee shop, there's the bike police. So all of this sort of being woven in so that all of a sudden that idea that this is valued and that there are all the full wraparound services to go along with that form of mobility, just like we've done for the car, right? So you can drive off very easy into a drive-by Starbucks and pick up your coffee, like all the things we've built in the culture to sort of make that easy. What if you are doing that for these other forms of mobility? Okay, so the second one, what is safe and safe for whom and how safe is safe? So, you know, here's the statistic for worldwide of how many folks are sort of dying on streets around the world. It's pretty staggering, in my opinion. So this is a real issue, and it's interesting how we accept certain externalities, you know, and how we get used to this, and we're just like, yeah. So a number of people die every year on our streets. That's just okay. I mean, the truth is we've all decided that it's okay. I mean, we talk about it like it's a problem, and yes, of course, we'd like to have less rather than more, but we have accepted that the freedom that the car gives us is worth the price of so many deaths a year. I mean, and society does this all the time. But that is what we have decided. And so, you know, is it possible as we go into the future that we could reduce these? Well, this is the one place where autonomous vehicles, you know, maybe have something to stick in the ground and say, hey, we could potentially really do something here, right? But I find, at least, that it's full autonomy doesn't actually make a lot of sense to me, and I don't think it's actually going to make us safer, unless potentially we're all willing to get chipped. Because essentially, if you are not in a vehicle that's giving off a signal, the car does not really recognize you. I mean, there's a lot of new stuff happening, and they've got now, I think, is it BMW, I think, in Europe, or Israel? Whoever's testing in Israel, Intel, that's who it is. Intel in Israel, they did do one that it didn't use anything except cameras and was able to spend 20 minutes driving through a city and recognizing pedestrians. So technology is coming along, but essentially these technologies need you to, as a human being, essentially, on your bike or as a pedestrian or on your scooter or whatever, to sort of give off a signal the same way another vehicle gives off a signal, right? And so, you know, can it truly sort of live up to the safety that we want it to, unless we are willing to sort of go to that place? Because a lot of the new technologies that they're trying, it's all based on your cell phone. Either your cell phone is communicating out for you and is being sort of your chip, or vice versa, the device, the car, is communicating to your cell phone, and your cell phone then talks to you and sort of provides, if you will, the way human beings make eye contact. The vehicle is sort of making eye contact with you through your cell phone. Does that make sense? So that's a lot of the technology that they're trying right now. So, you know, I go for walks sometimes without my phone. Crazy, but I do. So am I invisible because I didn't bring my cell phone with me that day? Or what about 4-year-olds? They don't usually have cell phones. Not yet. Not yet. That's what I mean. We may all get chipped, and so this all might work. But you know, it's a really interesting question. On the other hand, I think the way that they're moving right now with the ability for it to assist a person, so to make a person a little smarter, make less mistakes. I didn't see that car in my blind spot. It'd be great if my car said, I actually see your blind spot, and I'm telling you there's something there even if you missed it, right? Nothing wrong with that, and that can make a big difference, right? That could really change the safety numbers, but we don't have to get to this level where the car has to do it all by itself, and they're sitting there trying to figure out, how do we make the car just, you know, have eye contact with the person, because you kind of do that thing at an intersection with the driver, you know? That's really complicated. It seems like why are we spending that much energy to get to that level? I'm not quite sure, just so we can all sit in the car and not touch a wheel, but it's interesting. And then of course, there's a whole different level of safety, which is the sort of one that, you know, we're dealing with at this day almost on an in and out basis. It's just, you know, how do we deal with speed and the fact that speed kills and that, you know, drivers have a lot of road rage. And what's the right level of protection that we need for the more vulnerable users? And really this idea of good design, I think, is just so important here. I was just in Pittsburgh having this discussion with the folks as we're doing a master mobility plan for downtown Pittsburgh. And they were complaining about all these different things. And I said, I totally get it. Those are all real and valid things. But the problem is you just have really poor design right now. Everybody can do everything anywhere in the street. And so it's chaos. And that's leading to a lot of unsafe conditions. We've got to get you a design that's intuitive for safety. And of course, you know, these days, a lot of folks in a lot of cities are putting a lot of energy into Vision Zero. And so this is how some of this is translating, right? This idea of, is any death acceptable? It's funny, I had this argument with the mayor of Detroit, who would not go with Vision Zero. And I was just in Phoenix, and they just voted Vision Zero down. So it sounds pretty simple. Why should we go for anything other than zero deaths? But it is not universal. And I think it's important to sort of remember that, because again, I think sometimes when you get in this space, you can be like, well, of course, everyone's doing it. This is the coolest thing. You go to conferences, everyone's talking about Vision Zero. It is still incredibly controversial even to do these types of things, even to set a goal. And, you know, some of it's politics. You know, with our mayor, he doesn't believe in saying anything that he can't do. And so the idea of saying going to get to zero deaths to him just doesn't make any sense, because he's like, but I can't promise them that. And we were like, but it's okay. It's okay if you don't get there. It's a goal that needs to live on potentially beyond you, right? So it's interesting to see how that sort of plays out in the real world. So who owns the data and who owns the algorithms? So I am actually much less concerned about data, and I'm much more concerned about algorithms. Now, again, I'm saying that from a government perspective. It's a big thing right now. Governments are really struggling. Cities are struggling. There's all this data. It's being produced. If they don't have access to it, they can't do good design. And I think that's important. I think cities definitely need access to the data. I'm not sure that they need to own it, or even that they should own it. Cities have tons of data they just don't even know what to do with, quite frankly. Maybe someday when cities are fully equipped with data scientists of all different kinds and programmers, maybe then there's some sense in it. But right now, most of the time, cities have more data than they really know what to do with. They need that data to be scrubbed. They need that data to be analyzed. They need that data to be translated into formats that they can then use. So I think things like Populous and Remix are working on those types of things, and I think they make a lot of sense. But algorithms, the thing that tells you know, when I go on my phone and I say, I want to get to XYZ, and it tells me how to get there, and it takes me through a neighborhood, that's a problem. That's a real problem for cities. Because I'm doing all these things to keep you out of that residential street, and then the darn algorithm is just saying, yep, go right through there, and I don't want you to go through there, right? That takes away my ability as the city to sort of make rational sense of land use and transportation, because that algorithm doesn't care about land use. It only cares about transportation, which is great, but not. So I think you know, this is the big fight that's happening in LA, right? Salita is like taken into the Uber and her man, and she's like, no, I own the algorithms, not you. And they're like, what? We invented this stuff. And she's like, I don't care who invents it. I need to have control over this stuff, and they're suing each other. So this stuff is happening in real time. So what does equitable mobility look like, and how do you make it happen? So this is a really important question. And I think one of the places that it's playing out the most is in congestion pricing and curb pricing. And I actually think that this is one of the most exciting things that's going on. I actually think very little congestion pricing will happen in the United States in the way that like New York City is going to go. It's great for New York City. You know, Manhattan's pretty much an island, got a lot of bridges, control points, tolls anyway, great, works. But most of the rest of the United States is not that way. And quite frankly, most of the rest of the world isn't really that way. Cities don't have these lovely little beautiful borders with, you know, defined sort of entry points. And yes, there's a lot of things you can sort of do with geofencing and stuff, but there's sort of a lot of issues there, I think, and a lot of sort of equity issues. But what Chicago is doing, where they have said, okay, Lyft and Uber and any other TNC that's out there, you want to drive during our most congested times of the day and bring people into our downtowns? Well, that's going to be geofenced so that you get charged an extra whatever if you're going to do that. Because at that moment, that real estate is worth a lot, and you are taking it up in a serious way, probably driving, you know, 1 to maybe 3 people around. So great, that's a fee. It's a, you know, disincentive, incentive kind of thing. That doesn't really get to equity. But the fact that you can then take that money and you can use it to build the transit line for the underserved neighborhood, or better yet, which is what Chicago's doing, but better yet, you can take it another step, and this is where I want to go. What if I actually paid the person who's on the overcrowded bus? Right? So on the overcrowded, let's just say I'm on the overcrowded bus. I am making room for the person over here who needs to take that lift that day, right? If I wasn't on the overcrowded bus, that person on the lift, it would take them maybe an extra 10 minutes to get to work. So I'm going to charge you a little bit more to take that lift, and then I could potentially pay that person on the overcrowded bus. And you might say that's kind of crazy, but it's really not, because the new way we're doing fares these days with the new fare card systems, they're banking cards, money can flow both ways on them. I can tell exactly where you are, what trips you're taking, depending on what type of card it is. I can even know something about your income, so we can even skew it so that, you know, it can be different types of benefits depending on where you are on the income level. There's actually some great things happening in Australia where they're doing some really great things with the integrated fare, right? So, and especially now, if my fare card works, to do this, your fare card has to work for all your mobility types, right? So, but if you combine the technology we've got now and integrated fares, and like a congestion pricing, these things can start to come together, right? And we can really actually drive equity in some really interesting ways this way. And that to me is really something that's exciting from a congestion pricing perspective. Of course, equity is, you know, is interwoven into so many things. We were talking before this a little bit. This is a project that I worked on. I negotiated the international bridge between Canada and the United States in Detroit. We're building a new bridge over to Canada. It's going into the Delray neighborhood. Surprise, surprise, the Delray neighborhood is a majority African American and Hispanic neighborhood. Check. It is a neighborhood that is suffering already from huge environmental injustice. So these folks have 25% higher morbidity rates across a whole series of things because it's already an area that's incredibly polluted. So check, we'll put another big polluting thing in that space. You know, the way the federal government does work is that if you're in the footprint, you will get bought out. But if you are across the street from the footprint, you will not. So my neighborhood gets wrecked, but I have no option, right? My housing value goes completely kaput and nothing I can do. So here I am a minority living in an already underserved area, which, oh, by the way, is already geographically so cut off that sometimes ambulances can't get into here because the freight lines, they have the cars stopped in just the right place. Like there's no way in, and the highway, there's I-75, and it's just a whole combination of things. So it's really fun to step into this space because I didn't have any choice in terms of whether there was going to be a bridge or not. My job was to figure out how to get community benefits out of the bridge. Because up until this point, even though the project had been going on for 10 years, the city had not been involved at all because the city was a mess. And so what was interesting was that the community had been advocating for itself for quite some time and really trying, and they had done a lot of really great research on their own. And they had all the figures around the health and just all the stuff, but they weren't getting any traction. Nobody was doing anything. And so we came in and we negotiated about $80 million worth of community benefits. The bridge is still happening, but what we did say was that anybody who lived in the Delray neighborhood and even a little bit north of the Delray neighborhood, we would swap homes with them for free. So they could pick any home in Detroit. We would renovate the house for them. They could help pick out the finishes. We opened a center just like a developer would right in the community. You come in, they would take you on tours of different homes that were available. You could pick your home, you could then pick the finishes. The city would renovate that house and you would swap basically the deeds with your existing house. Not perfect, but it at least gave people the option, and because Detroit has a large amount of vacancy, we could even move multiple families together, which was a big issue in this neighborhood, especially in the Latino community. It's not just them, it's their mom lives over there, and their aunt lives over there, and their brother lives over there, and they want to stay together, right? And so moving whole groups of folks and being able to do that type of stuff. For those who want to stay, we got $12 million of complete streets. We got $10 million of job training that was only for Detroiters. We got health monitoring, a whole health impact study, a lot of vibration monitoring and air quality monitoring, and just a whole bunch of stuff. So I think what's interesting about projects like this is people think this stopped happening. Like, oh yeah, we did that back in like the 60s with, urban gentrification, renewal. It's still happening. And I'm not gonna say that, what we did made it perfect, but it was definitely at least acknowledged that these things were real and put some real resources behind it, and really reflected what the community felt they wanted and needed. But equity takes a lot of different forms. I think stuff like this is really quite interesting. These are shoes. They've actually become, the design has gotten more sleek, but you put these things on and you can walk indoor and out, but at much, much faster than you normally would be able to, which I think is really cool to see, sort of pedestrians getting a little kind of equity in the mobility game.
This slow lane or the fast lane?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. This idea, even in bikes, get more and more the electric bikes. This is a foldable electrical bike that GM is making, believe it or not. I got to ride one in Toronto. It was a lot of fun. Problem, of course, is that for whatever reason, they don't sell them in the United States, only in other countries, which I think is part of the equity issue. But it's interesting to see how these things are developing. So then what is resilient infrastructure and who is responsible for building it? This is a huge one. Because I made the big fuss about the climate change and all this stuff, all this change. Well, resilient infrastructure is just that, right? It's infrastructure that can deal with this change and not have to be rebuilt. Do you have questions?
About the home swap program, just a little bit of funding source was for that.
So that's a whole lecture in and of itself. So we essentially extorted it out of the Canadians, but we did it in a very clever and legal way. So if you know anything about the Gordie Howe Bridge, it's actually being funded by the Canadians. It's going to be tolled, so it's a public-private partnership. It'll be paid back over a 35-year time horizon. We're being recorded. I don't know how much I want to say, but let's just say that we negotiated with them to do it, and they needed land from us, and so we basically set a price on that land. Really, what it came down to.
There is time for questions at 3 o'clock, and the mic goes off at 2.
So, again, I sort of talked about this in the beginning and about economic systems. I mean, I think this is a place where it's really interesting to compare sort of what you see happening in other parts of the world, not least of which is sort of China versus the United States, and this whole idea of different economic systems sort of producing different issues, and different solutions. But the free market is not really good at dealing with externalities, right? And right now, a lot of this stuff around resilience and climate and sustainable design falls into that category. And it's really one of the reasons that this is so tumultuous and so hard, because we don't have good ways of sort of working it into the economy, which is why I said at the beginning that there is that economic shift that's out there. And it's really sort of, in a lot of ways, the other shoe that hasn't dropped, because I'm not sure you can do this within our economic system as it currently exists. And what does that mean? Because again, we don't do well with changing economic systems. And I'm not up here to say I think like our economic system is bad. I mean, I like our economic system. I generally want this thing to be able to continue. But we've got to figure this out, right? And so, how do we refine those externalities? How do we make these things part of the bottom line? And I think the issue is going to be if we can do this, if we can redefine culture and values, because that's a way of then getting them into the triple bottom line without radically changing the economic system. So and you see that, you see that happening. So how do we deal with this, and sort of answer this question of sort of adaptation and mitigation and start to work these things in. And we were talking about this before. This is this example. This isn't all of them, but these are these different sort of types of cities that we're seeing around the world. And you can see how they cluster in different countries and different continents. And really what that is a reflection of the economic systems of those countries. And so how does all that translate down into what happens sort of on a daily basis? Well, obviously it begins to happen sort of in projects like this. This is the Riverwalk in Chicago that I worked on. It's a great public amenity. It was all part of reconstructing Wacker Drive, which is a two-way, two-level street. It's got all the loading underneath. It's got a lot of complete street stuff on the top. But this whole thing, of course, is designed to deal with flooding and a 9-foot, elevation change in water. So it's there, it's doing all these other things that we typically think of around great cities and mobility, but it's also got a lot of resilience built into it. It's projects like this. This is Cermak Road that I built in Chicago. National Geographic labeled this the greenest street in America and said it was part of the climate solution. And I only say that in that, it's got a lot of the things that you might think of and green stormwater infrastructure, a lot of things you don't see here, pavements with 50% recycled content and micro-thin concrete overlays and photocatalytics, permeable pavers and stuff like that. But the upshot is that these two shots were taken on the same day in Chicago. there were a number of streets throughout Chicago that looked like this. Cermak looked like that. So it was completely able to, be usable immediately.
Did you guys use local vegetation when you guys were creating the street and stuff?
Yeah, there's a lot of native. It's not exclusive because the truth is there are, you're dealing with a lot of things besides just water. When you're dealing with plants on a street, you're dealing with pollutants, you're dealing with, quite frankly, drought. And so you got to find that there are plants both, you got to find the right plant. And for me, it's less important when it's completely native or not, but yes, most of them pretty indigenous. It's doing stuff like this, right? Where you're really integrating the modes, you're really providing those different levels of safety for pedestrians, for bicyclists, prioritizing transit. This is some of the bike lanes and transit lanes right in downtown Chicago that we did. It's doing projects like this. This is one of the shared streets. I've gotten to work on 4 shared streets so far, which has been a really interesting process, and I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later too. But I don't believe in curbs anymore. I don't think we should be building curbs at all, because curbs are something that takes away that flexibility. So going back to where we started, right? We need flexibility. So today, maybe I can only convince you to do a 4-lane street. And I am not going to get anyone to let me do 3 lanes right now. But you know what? 10 years from now, it may be perfectly reasonable to do a 3-lane street. Well, it'll cost me millions of dollars to change from a 4-lane to 3-lane. And you know why? Because of a 6-inch curb. That's kind of crazy. And you know why curbs were invented? Curbs were invented really because when the cars came along, they were like, these pesky pedestrians keep walking in the street and we need them out. And so if we make these little curbs, they'll tell the pedestrian where they need to be and where the car will need to be. We got lots of ways to do that these days. We do not need a curb. The other thing, of course, we use a curb for is for water. But we don't need to do that anymore either. That's just sort of the convention we came up with, is say, oh yeah, you run the water to a curb and then the curb to an outlet, but you don't need that. So the nice thing about shared streets is not only can they do wonderful things like this and be programmed very easily, but they can be a lot more flexible at much lower cost. So as we need to change, or even if we get to the point where we can change, within even a given day or throughout the year, they're going to allow us to do that. So how will the relationship between land use and mobility change? So this is really, really important for a number of reasons, because the world has more problems than transportation, right? Transportation and mobility is just a piece of it, right? I mean, California, you guys, housing, huge, huge issue. In fact, it's kind of this weird thing that now, isn't it? I mean, think about the irony that our streets have essentially become houses, housing. I mean, you go, I mean, I was just in LA and I was in San Francisco, and I mean, you're like, our streets have become housing.
Campgrounds.
Yeah. So that's got to change. Not a good solution. We did not build the streets to be housing. So, how are we integrating these things? And we've just got to really do a lot better job. And this really just gets to this idea of really needing to use sort of, a human-centered policy. And humans have multiple needs and complex things going on. So again, how does this start to show up in the real world? This is I-375 in Detroit, shortest highway in the world, I believe, but still it's a highway that goes right into the center of Detroit because, it's Detroit. That's what we do. And so I just tried to show you this in one slide, but if you can sort of imagine from here to the top of that blue, right, that was all the highway. It's a big sunken highway, traditional limited access, streets go over it, right? And so they needed to rebuild it. reached its useful life. They were going to come back and basically rebuild the trench, and we said, you know, we really don't want to. Now, little history here. Now, going back to that, you know, earlier urban renewal, this, of course, was where all the African Americans lived when they built this highway. This was Black Bottom, and that's where, of course, they decided they needed to build a highway, and they just ripped through a very vibrant neighborhood with lots of African American owned businesses and very affordable housing right close to downtown, and they built a highway, which was a big sunken trench that then separated all the residential over there from here. And what happened? All that residential died and, you know, became blight, which justified, of course, what they were doing, which then they actually wiped all that away. So that's a longer story. But so we said, we want this back. We want this to be a street again. And so they did some things, and they said, oh, you know what? It's really kind of interesting. If we make it a street, we can save actually like $50 million. We're like, good. And then, of course, they came back and they designed a street that was as wide as that whole space. And we said, no. And it had this huge median in the middle. And we were like, what are we going to do with the huge median in the middle that no one's going to maintain? And MDOT, you know, you're not going to maintain it. You're going to turn around to the city and say, you need to maintain this thing. And we're going to be like, yeah, we don't have any money. And what do we don't need more like vacant, empty land in Detroit. Like, that's not what we need. Never mind. You know, of course, it was going to take, I don't know, some ridiculous 250 seconds to cross it as a pedestrian. It's like some obscene, you know, lots of things that were wrong with it. We said, nuh-uh. And so we pushed really, really hard, and we got the road down to half of the space. Now you're like, what does this have to do with land use, Janet? Well, the battle, which became a pretty big battle in terms of, again, this is where engineering sort of meets land use, right? So they still like, well, no, we got to do Michigan left. Does anybody know what a Michigan left is? Michigan left is like an evil. Some engineer invented it that I just want to. He went to Michigan State, so. But it's the idea that it's safer for pedestrians to eliminate left turns at an intersection. So instead, you're going to go right and then left and then right. I don't know, some crazy two. Yeah, you're going to do right and then you're going to make a U-turn and then go straight so that you can do this. But in this case, because they had service drive, you actually had to make up to 6 turns instead of having to make that left. Yeah. And we were like, over our dead bodies, are you going to do this to us? And of course, if you do that, because you have to protect the shadow of the car, you have to have, you know, at least a 50-foot wide median in the middle. And we're like, no, you do not want the median. Anyway, how this all plays out is we managed through a lot of painful but good, strong engineering, narrowing lanes and everything. Oh, and of course, they only wanted 10-foot sidewalks. We got to 25-foot sidewalks. We got to 150 feet, and that 150 feet is magical because we had 300 feet. And what's the minimum you need for a good development parcel? 150 feet. So that blue had to be 150 feet because I wanted it to develop. I did not want a bunch of dead land use. All right, so what is the best energy source for mobility? So the world is gearing up to go electric. We'll see. There are choices to be made. We may go there, we may not. There's obviously some really big benefits to us going electric in terms of just our immediate footprint right now and our emissions. It really is, I think, doable in over like a 10-year horizon. I really think we're there. I think we could really make this happen. And so there's a lot of great things there and some things that we need to do. And it's really interesting from that shared mobility because electric mobility can really scale.
I'm wondering where food consumed for walking, bicycling and so forth fits in the best.
And then I like that. I have to admit, I didn't address that, but I like it. I like it. Yes, right. That's a different type of energy, but an important one. Of course, the issue with electric is that it's only as good as where the electricity is coming from. So if the electricity is coming from coal, hopping in your electric car is not doing very good. But this is something, a personal story. My sister bought an all-electric car in Houston, of all places. But in Houston, she has access to full renewable energy that she doesn't pay anything for after 8 o'clock at night. So they bought an electric car, they plug it in, they charge it all night, doesn't cost them anything. And anyway, and the power that is going into it is all green. So that, I think, is just an interesting story that you can do that right now in the United States, in Houston, of all places. So it can be done, but there is a lot of work, and we have to look at the whole sort of chain. And of course, electric there are a lot of different choices, and the truth is that battery electric is really not the one that's going to address the resiliency and the sustainable the best probably over the long term, but it's probably where we need to start, just given that the other options need a lot more infrastructure. Even though charging stations are a big infrastructure, it's nothing compared to basically, hydrogen stations and other things like that we are just a long way away from at this point. So how will we determine how projects get funded? So the reason this is important and relates to these other things, of course, is if you want to drive all these things, you've got to look at how where the money goes, so will the projects. Now, California, of course, you guys are way ahead of the rest of the country at actually trying to tie these things to your funding. And so it's really interesting to see sort of what's playing out here. But it plays out in the other parts of the country in all sorts of ways. I put this picture, this is the Navy Pier flyover, which is a project I built in Chicago. It's a bike and pedestrian path. But why it's really here is because it was all funded with CMAQ funding. So congestion mitigation and air quality funding, which is a pretty major source that a lot of places are getting, a lot of major cities are getting that don't meet attainment, right? In Chicago, this project was rated the #1 priority for CMAQ funds for several years in a row. This is rebuilding the lakefront trail right through the downtown, which does get 60,000 people a day, not vehicles, people a day. But I went to Detroit. They don't use CMAQ funding to do anything like this. You can't get CMAQ funding to pay for anything like this. It only will pay for like signal interconnects and traffic management facilities. That's it. So even in something like that that's been around for a while, it is a major source that a lot of major cities across the country use, that you think that there would be some sort of commonality or understanding of what that funding is. It's not, and every MPO gets to make up their formula, and they do not do it the same. Yes. Oh, you didn't have a question? Oh, I saw your hand. I thought you were. You can make one up. So these things that, again, I think sometimes when we talk about this stuff, it's like, well, of course, but if you dig down to why this stuff isn't happening, this is the stuff you need to attack. It's like, we got to rewrite that formula so that, this kind of stuff can get funded through that kind of funding, because it's the only pot that we've got most of the time for this kind of stuff. It's not like, oh, there's 10 other ones. No, it's like, this is it. So, and then of course it's policies. This is the Sustainable Urban Infrastructure Guidelines and Policies that I led in Chicago. And this was sort of my attempt, after doing a whole series of projects and sort of implementing them on the ground, of saying, all right, great, did all this stuff. lot of really good things, attacked a lot of these issues that we're talking about. I don't want it just to be done on my projects. How do I get the department to do this? How do we put this into business as usual, right? Which is really what a lot of this stuff is. When I talk about tools, what I'm trying to do is figure out how to build things that allow folks to make this business as usual in their decision-making process, right? And so, you know, in this case, we had our categories. They had very place-based specific objectives. What you're not seeing here is all the requirements, and the requirements sort of scaled up over time. The key, of course, to making this work was not all that part. The key to making it work was that we had to spend a lot of time understanding how project managers actually did their projects. And then we had to customize this tool to their processes, so that what all they had to do is type in the type of project that they had, and everything they didn't have to worry about disappeared, and what they saw was what they had to worry about, and what that was relatively speaking a small lift from where they were, right? Trying to make it as easy as possible, not necessarily the goal, but the process behind the goal, right? So how will risk be distributed? This is a really important question when we start to talk about all this stuff, because everything we just talked about is risk. It's all risk, right? Do you believe in that risk? This first question. And if you do believe in it, well, where's that risk? Who's holding that risk, right? Because that gets into how the funding goes, right? And what funding possibilities are out there, whether someone's willing to fund it at all. So this is a really interesting thing, I think, that you know, needs to be thought about, and really is very sort of policy driven. Like how do we start to create these policies that allow these risks to be shared in a sort of meaningful way that then begins to loosen up some of the capital that's out there, but also doesn't, you know, keep it as an externality that isn't part of the equation. How will public-private partnerships redefine mobility and its delivery and its funding? So the reason this is particularly important now, even though the sort of concept of public-private partnerships has certainly been around for plenty of time, I think the issue is when you're talking about this level of change, and it's funny because, and this is a little bit too where different it works a little differently in different parts of the world. People tend to think about public partnerships as ways to get really big infrastructure done in a quicker way than maybe the government could do it. It never actually costs you less. Actually, private capital is at a higher interest rate than public capital, period, no questions asked. So the Gordie Howe is a great example of a traditional public-private partnership, right? Really big infrastructure, there's a defined revenue source. You know, the private side is willing to take on that risk because of those the conditions, and they can bring capital and they can sort of make this huge mega project sort of happen. But where I'm more interested actually is on the really small level, because when you've got things that are changing this quickly, governments don't do that well. This is one of the places where governments have a really hard time. We are not light on our feet that way. So for instance, I did the Make Way for People program in Chicago. I had 0 funds. Yeah. I had my hours and my staff's hours. Other than that, we had no money. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to make it lighter, quicker, easier, and cheaper for people to experiment in the public right of way and to get more programming and more activity and more programming. So, you know, we did things like parklets and people alleys and made it so that, you know, you could come out and you could paint the street and do all that kind of stuff. That's great, but I wanted to activate all our existing plazas that we had. And I wanted to get the arts in there, and I wanted all this stuff. Well, as a government, my ability to do like a whole bunch of like $1,000 to $2,000 arts contracts as a DOT, they all have to go through an RFP process. Most artists look at you like, are you mad? I'm not going to do all that. I mean, it just does not work, right? And I was like, how am I going to do this? And so what we did was we put out an RFP and we said, we will give an entrepreneur access to certain pop-up retail rights and certain limited advertising rights. In return, they will manage all of our spaces, and they have to hire the artists and activate the spaces. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's essentially what we did. So we formed a public-private partnership. I had no capital, but I had an asset that I could offer, which allowed an entrepreneur, which turned out to be a young minority female woman who stepped up and won the RFP. She designed and opened up these pop-up retail spaces, which then she engaged further entrepreneurs and community groups into that process, and gave new businesses a place to like start with little pop-up retail in some of the greatest places in Chicago. And she, of course, with her profits, was able to do all sorts of teeny little artist contracts that I couldn't do. And go out and work with the community and find out like, oh, there's this local artist, or there's this dance group, or this kind of thing. So it was a way that we could sort of strategically allow for this new ecology to sort of develop and be very flexible, right? So then who bears the cost? Okay, where am I? Ooh, really? Oh my God, I'm talking way too slow. Okay, so who bears the cost of climate change, of equity, and of technology shifts? You know, we've sort of been talking about this throughout. These are big numbers, and they're going to require big dollars. This is not easy stuff, especially when, again, where we started, we're not like funding this stuff. And the issue, of course, is that we have to act, even with what we're seeing today. It's because if we don't act, we know by 2050 it's going to be really ugly. And that's hard, right? That makes it even harder. So, you know, this is the Green Alley program, and again, something we did in Chicago, trying to take something that you do every day and really change it, you know, not only in put in permeable pavements, but invent new technologies that use recycled materials. And really this whole concept of that, you know, we're just not really doing enough. So how do we really begin to sort of, you know, address some of these bigger picture and begin to make a difference? And it's interesting to see how this is sort of playing out. You know, you see now things like Toyota saying that they're going to make, you know what they called it, their new city, right? In Japan, right? Underneath beautiful mountain, virgin green land. They're going to create their little utopia where they can implement all their new technology in a green field with employees that will get to sign away their rights to all their data. That's one model. I bring that up because what you're seeing though in that is this need to figure out urbanism, but finding real urbanism too challenging. And so they're beginning to create these sort of cities. And you're seeing that play out in a lot of ways. I mean, even what like Google is doing in Toronto with Sidewalk Labs, right? That's a little better because it's in a real city, but they're carving out their own sort of part of the city, the new part, and they're trying to figure that out. What does that really sort of look like, right? That's another example. You've got, I always get confused, Cincinnati, right? Who's won the Smart Cities Challenge from the feds. They have, there's awash in money, and they are really struggling to figure out, they can't spend this money because they're trying to figure out how do we actually do this? What does this really look like, this future? How are we doing this? How are we doing it in a way that doesn't separate people out, that isn't super exclusive, that deals with the kind of change, because the engineering is taking us so long that by the time we're done with the environmental process we've got to go through, the technology has changed so much that the project is sort of out of date. In Detroit, we redid the environmental on 2 projects already completely, because you know it takes them 10 years to get through this stuff. It's just crazy. We got to figure out some different ways of sort of doing it. But it's really interesting right now to see different places around the world sort of trying to figure this out, and different companies and different governments. So people are coming at it from lots of different sort of angles, and I'm really trying to figure this out. And I think I'm going to stop here, even though I have a lot more slides, because it's 3 o'clock. I don't want to give time for questions.
Any question?
A quick question.
Yes.
So given the globalization and gentrification of neighborhoods, how do you make streets the place for placemaking?
So that gets to that thing where I started about defining your outcomes. I just did this with the city of Phoenix, actually. So they hired us to do a curbside study. And they wanted me to come in and talk to them about technology and curb pricing, all this stuff. And I was like, nope, we're not gonna talk about that. So what we're gonna do first is a value exercise. Because how can I price your curb until I understand what's important to you? And so what we did is we had this big value exercise, and I made them value things in different ways. So I gave them all these different pictures, and I said, I want you to tell me how much you're gonna pay for this. Put dollar signs. Then I asked them, I said, just tell me which ones you like the best. So we put dots on the ones I like the best. And then I said to them, I gave them a whole bunch of stickies with externalities, like things like, vibrancy, sustainability, like all this kind of stuff. And I said, put them on the things where you associate them. And then we sat down and we looked at it, and it was not the same as you can imagine across those 3 different value premises, right? And then we had a discussion around value. And I said, you've got to be clear on your values. What matters? What are you trying to achieve? If you know that, I can turn around and price your curb, no problem. But if you don't, then it's all just chaos. And so that's what I mean. We don't know all this, but we can define what we want. That is something we can know. And the wonderful part of it is you do that by talking to people. You do that by engaging people. You go out there, you talk to people, you make them part of the process. You all together define a future. It's going to be messy. It's not everyone's going to exactly agree, but you come to a set of shared values and principles of what you want. Then all this stuff, it's just about being flexible enough to deal with it because you know where you're going. Come on, guys. Yes.
How do you choose the private sector? Like, why did you end up going to the private sector?
Well, I sort of touched on that at the beginning. I mean, it was a number of things. But are we past 3 o'clock? Okay. As I said, I'm hoping that the private sector is a place where maybe I can, bring what I know to more cities, right? That when you're working with one city, you're working with one city. And in any city job, you're tasked to do a task. And I tend to want to, as John sort of mentioned at the beginning, connect dots. The second thing is, though, I really think building these tools, I'm trying to figure out where's the right place to help build some of these tools to give decision makers. I know I talked a lot about engineers. I am not an engineer. I am a licensed architect. But I've spent a whole career working with engineers. I have tremendous respect. I love working with them. I think it's a great combination. But because I've also spent a lifetime of sort of getting engineers sometimes to think outside their comfort zone, I also understand why they don't, I think, and some of the barriers to that process. And so I have a lot of respect for that. I mean, engineers have to sign off on things that are life safety, right? And they get hauled into court and someone says, why did you do it differently? Because someone died and you did it differently. So you need to defend yourself, right? And the way they normally do that is they go, oh, here's what the rule book says, and here's what the data says, and here's what they'll say. So now if I want them to use data that's in the future, how are they going to defend themselves? Well, they need then to have some robust mechanisms upon which they can say, yes, you're right. We did something different based on future data, but it was best practice, and here is why and how, right? That needs to be there. Otherwise, we're going to just keep doing it. I just redesigned 2 highways. 3. And we got a lot of really cool stuff. I mean, I told you a little bit about them, and I only scratched the surface. but we could not make the big sort of fundamental shifts that needed to happen. And that was because essentially they're using the same tools they used in 1950s. It is absolutely true.
About data, you mentioned that maybe during this, till now to in 20 years, the data will be totally changed. So what's your suggestion for collecting data? And in this shifting time, what should we do?
Well, this, quite frankly, is where I am not the expert. I work with people who so obviously you still need to collect. One, it is already changing, and it's good for us to see, and you just always have to. And it's taking that existing data, it's still the climate scientists, the economists, they do take that, and then they've got ways now that they can sort of project that out. I'm not going to pretend to tell you that I'm an expert in exactly how that all happens, but there's modeling basically, and artificial intelligence, and all these other things that essentially are. That is where the technology is really interesting, right? That's where the technology, at least in theory, is able to take us into the future beyond what we have, right? So how are we using machine learning to actually help us be more predictive? Yes.
When you invite private sector to come and invest in public spaces or public infrastructure like EV charging and whatnot, do they usually ask how do you calculate the sort of value to us, because private sector usually thinks about profits and what sort of thing. How do you measure that? If it's like an EV charger that you set out, what sort of value will it bring to your business model?
Right. Well, that's why most of the electric chargers in this country are built by Tesla, because Tesla understands how it's part of their bottom line. He wants you to buy an electric car. He realizes that you will not buy an electric car if you don't have an electric charging station. So it's in his interest to invest some of his profit into building the infrastructure. I can't remember the name of the other company that's got the second most. They don't have that situation, but it's hard. It's been hard. It's part of the reason we don't have, Norway, different type of government. I think it's Norway, has the most in the world per capita. I just saw the numbers. I'm not going to remember, but they have a very different sort of socioeconomic situation than we have in the United States. So some of it's that, right? Some of these companies are recognizing that either their old business models are not going to carry forth into the future, and they're proposing new business models, and they're trying to figure this out. So for instance, one of the things I am doing is I'm helping Spin, which is a scooter company, put their first electric charging stations in the public right of way. And so again, they're developing. They started off, I'm going to take advantage of the city's free asset and just dump these things in the public right of way, right? But you know what? It costs them a fortune to go and rebalance these systems all the time and pick them up and charge them all the time. Well, if electric charging station, and this is where, again, congestion pricing, if you will, in a way, gets really fascinating, right? Because now I can incentivize you to put it in the back in the nice rack, because I will make it cheaper. You will get a discount if you bring your scooter back and put it into the charging station. Then I, as the private company, don't have to pick that scooter up and charge it. And the city says, great, there's more control over these things, and they're not all over the place, and I'm going to start to ban them, right? So some of this is the ecosystem is beginning to get more sophisticated, and as companies are sort of playing in the space, and that's again where that sort of, that to me is the more interesting public-private sort of relationship that is happening around mobility.
Do you have any suggestions for how to get some of those old engineering standards and practices changed and bring in some data on more emphasis on pedestrian safety and access that's not currently heavily, lack of data and not related.
So some of that stuff is beginning to creep in. Where it really gets tough is transit. or quite frankly, some of the new communications technologies that are needed to build. I mean, so okay, we're building 3 new highways in Detroit. That does not happen. Literally, hundreds, billions of dollars, okay? Highways get rebuilt maybe every 100 years, okay? So that infrastructure is gonna be around 100 years from now. Who thinks that 100 years from now it's gonna look anything like it is right now? No, okay. There is not a new piece of communications technology being put into those things. They would not do transit for me, no matter what I did or try to drive a mode shift, I was like, we don't want the mode share we have now. We want a very, very different mode share. Can't we build it for a different mode share? Because maybe we get it, Nope, because if I couldn't prove to them that I had that mode share. Therefore, they would not build it for a future mode share. I was only, if I could have shown that I had a 50% transit mode share, they would have said, sure. They were very clear about that. But because I have a 10% mode share, they're like, no, we're not gonna build you infrastructure for a 50%.
It's like, we don't need to do any pedestrian crossing here because no one's crossing and the cars are going 60 miles an hour.
And you're
So-
like, so why aren't people crossing? Because you built an infrastructure that doesn't make any sense for people to cross. I know, this is a really, really hard thing right now, that it's this idea that like, prove it to me and then I will build it. And it's like, well, no, I want, if you build it, they will come kind of philosophy. And that, we talk about that in dream movies. I mean, literally. It's not the way we do engineering. And again, I'm not completely dishing it. Like, I understand that. I understand why. I just know that needs to change. And so how do we do that? How do we build tools? And that's where LCAs and other interesting tools that I know some of you are working on could be very powerful. We just have to make it so that like a city project manager can use it and not so someone who has 3 PhDs. And I say that with all love because I've helped John with LCAs. And I think they're great.
What is LCA?
Do we want to talk about it? Or what did you guys talk about it?
It's life cycle assessment. So you look at the whole life cycle of an infrastructure and the supply chains that supply it, and you do try to address some of the indirect effects. Like if you're going to expand a highway, does that mean more traffic and more sprawl? So you try to capture some of those indirect effects when you can as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to build in the externalities.
Yeah,
That's the whole
exactly.
point.
Yeah.
So that
When you do the comparison, you can actually say something about the externalities for different technologies or designs that you might pursue.
This is kind of off topic, but so we talked about congestion before, right? Big cities. So Elon Musk was proposing the tunnel underground for the traffic. So how do you feel like? Do you think that would make a big impact if that was implemented, or?
wait, so say that again?
So like congestion is a big problem in
Yes.
cities. So Elon Musk proposed that underground.
Oh, Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Okay, that was the word I missed. I was like, wait, who did a tunnel underground?
Yeah. So do you think that would help with the problem with the congestion, or like, do you think it's more beneficial, or
So-
how would you feel?
Okay, so first of all, I don't think congestion's so bad. Now, it depends on what context. Congestion on a highway in the middle of nowhere, no, that's not good congestion. Congestion in cities, I think it's a sign of people.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I don't have such a problem with it. I mean, it's so funny because Detroit, which has no congestion, and they sit there and they complain to me about the congestion, and I just look at them and I go, probably because we don't have enough congestion. That's why we're struggling still on the economic side. Can we have more congestion? So now, I mean, that's not quite what Elon Musk is talking about. The thing is, again, you gotta think about the externalities. So what are the consequences of building that type of infrastructure? What kind of world does it create? Is it people first? And if it can address some of those things in the right way, if done in the right way, then I think it can be okay. But if it just creates sexy things for sexy things' sake, then no. I mean, one of the problems we have right now is we have a lot of technology in search of a problem. A lot. I mean, these companies, they come to cities all the time. Ooh, you want the sexy new thing? And I'm like, what problem are you solving for me? If you're solving a problem for me, I am all for the sexy new thing. But if you're not, and you just kind of want me to buy your sexy new thing because you will get more shareholder price, like, I'm not interested. That's not the point. That's not getting, again, to my values, right? What are my values? What am I trying to do? If you come to me and say, I've got something that's gonna address this problem, I'm like, great, let's talk about that. You know, we're gonna be all over it. Now, the other problem with technology is the proprietary aspect of it. I mean, one of the reasons cities don't adopt some of this stuff is not because they don't want to. It's because, one, if they do finally make a decision to go with someone, 2 years later, they're out of business. And for a city, that's devastating. I just replaced all my LEDs with this light and now it's no longer made. Oh my. You know, or the other reason that I used to have this problem all the time is I wanted to introduce all this like different sort of smart technology, but you know, the irrigation system, well, that's this guy over here with his proprietary system, and my smart lights is this guy over here with his proprietary system, and my compacting trash can is this guy over here with his proprietary system. I was like, I can't have like 10 different proprietary systems that don't work together. I want one dashboard, and I want them all to come into that, and I want it to be open software, so that if you go out of business, it's okay, because it's all built on, you know, open platform. And this is, you know, that's the push and pull right now that's happening with the private side, because they're trying to figure out what the business model is, and the cities are trying to say, look, we want to do this, we want to pilot with you, we want to try these things, but you can't expect us to just, you know, be your, I don't know, trampoline laboratory. Yes, your free laboratory. Really, roads are like fiber. I mean, right? And think about what we did in this country with fiber. We had the big mothership, AT&T, and had built this incredible infrastructure, quite frankly, like our highways, with a lot of help from the government, right? A lot of protection that allowed them to do that. We broke them apart specifically so that we could get smaller companies and innovation into the practice. Of course, then we deregulated, which was the problem, because when we deregulated, meant that they now can charge those guys whatever they want for using their system, which is how they're now pushing people out. Well, the streets are kind of like that. They're like the fiber. And all these mobility companies are essentially like writing software that needs, you know, the fiber of the street, and the cities are going, we just can't take care of this. And especially now when you guys come to us and say, oh, and by the way, your infrastructure needs to be in really good shape and it needs to have 5G and all this other stuff in it, because otherwise our toys don't work. And it's like, we can't even fix the potholes. And you want me to do what? Keep all the lines perfectly striped because that's what you need for your car? Like, I mean, there's got to be a shared thing there, right? I mean, the city can't just, unless we want to do a different tax structure, which at least right now in this country, we are unwilling to do. Yes.
From a city official's perspective, are you in favor of like San Francisco Market Street, where no
Market Street?
Like in Germany, some cities?
Yeah.
Would you be okay with that? What are the complications?
Yeah, no, I think Market Street is great. Now, you know, Market Street, everyone's making a big deal because it's not going to have cars. Have you ever been on Market Street? It's only got like 100,000 buses and trolleys and whatever. So, I mean, to me, it's like, you know, it's still got so much mobility that, you know, the fact that they've just decided to not put the cars in, which didn't really have much space kind of in a way to begin with because of all the other uses that were out there, it's sort of a no-brainer. So I think it's fine. I do think that, you know, they'll have to work on it. You know, Chicago did that. State Street was transit and taxis and people, and it failed miserably. But I think Market Street's going to work just fine. Most people that are there now are not coming in cars.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
I was wondering in Phoenix, so I'm from Phoenix actually, so it's interesting you mentioned that they voted against Vision Zero, because I thought it's actually that they were more for it, because is actually interned with the street department. They were working on vision.
Yep. The street department was for it.
Okay.
The city council voted it down.
Also, okay. And then, so when you met with them, did you meet with the street department, or who did you?
Yeah.
talk to?
Yeah, we did meet with the street department.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, like you said, you talked about like their values and so forth. So, kind of where were they leading as far as their like?
Their values were very good, actually.
Okay.
It was really getting them, the problem Phoenix is having is Phoenix actually has all this really great guidance that really states their values actually pretty clearly.
Yeah.
And they've even put it into code. The problem they're having is they can't enforce their own stuff.
Yeah, especially the complete streets.
Yeah. Well, their complete streets policy is lacking. I did tell them that their complete streets policy needs to be more robust.
Okay.
But their issue is one, that things aren't integrated. So for instance, all their land use stuff doesn't refer to their complete streets and sort of vice versa. So there needs to be some integration. And they do need a little bit more work. But a lot of it is that they, it's either not clear enough or too complex, and the combination is making it so that most of the time they don't actually enforce what they've put down in writing. And so the developer comes along and says, but I want my portico share and I need it to be 300 feet and I need valet parking and I need to put my column in the middle of your sidewalk. And somehow, even though they have all those things written down, they say yes. And you're like, ooh, okay, you guys, it was very clear once we did the values. It's like, well, this is what you really care about. This is, and then I would show them pictures about, not everywhere, I also showed them where they were doing it right, but I said, look at all the places where it's not getting implemented. Like, this is what you want, this is what's in your code, this is what's actually happening. So we're trying to help them dive into their code and be like, all right, what's making this happen? Like a great example is this. It says, if you want to get a valet curb cut, you have to pay I can get this right. I think it's $10 a day forever to make up for the lost parking, for every lost parking space. Okay, that's kind of ridiculous. Nobody's really going to charge that to the developer. So what happens is they're not charging at all. It gets waived, right? Because they're like, well, that's crazy. Everybody agrees it's crazy, and so it doesn't get happen. So now the disincentive that was supposed to be there with the fee is completely eliminated, and everyone gets a curb cut, which wrecks the sidewalk. Right? And so it's helping them to be like, okay, let's put reasonable fees that are punitive to, or based around your values, or incentivizing based on your values, but that are reasonable enough that you will actually enforce them, right? And that they're not going to just go running to their city council person and be like, this is ridiculous, and everyone's going to be like, yeah, it's ridiculous, and we're not going to, right? Stuff like that.
Okay.
That's sort of the nitty gritty of when you get down to it, of like, why is this happening?
Because I've seen a lot, like with the complete streets and stuff, like they talk like the city council meetings, but not a lot seems to get done, or it's like really, I guess, slow, which I guess is kind of typical of public sector. But I just like I've been wondering, like you see, like they talk about all this good stuff they've been working on, but then.
And they do, as I said, like I read at first, I was like, oh, maybe they need better guidance, and then I was reading it all, and I was like, no, you guys have like really good guidance. I was like, so there's a disconnect. Well, you've got good guidance, and you're unhappy about what you're getting, but there's something happening in the middle, and it's the silly things. It's the permits. It's like the permitting process and the stuff like that. To get a permit, all you need to turn it is one 8.5 by 11 site plan. Like, okay, well, you need a lot more than that, right? Like, so it's silly stuff like that. It's silly, but it makes a big difference. So it's like unpacking that kind of stuff and saying, all right, where's it breaking down? And then it's education and training, right? Because if the guy who's doing the permit or the gal doesn't understand those principles and values, then they are not going to carry through with the implementation. So it's not good enough that a few people understand principles and values. That's why it's so important that it's actually done with people. Because if it's not internalized, not only within the citizens, but actually also within the government, it's very easy to break down, right? People have to understand it. That's why when I did that sustainable urban infrastructure guidelines, I think, you know, one of my sort of proud moments was when we rolled it out and we did this thing. We actually brought the whole department together, which pretty much like never happens. We did an official presentation. I did very little of the presentation. So because I had been working with all these different people through the department, I had them actually give the presentation so that it felt like this belonged to the department, like this was us. And I'll tell you a little dirty secret. A lot of what I did isn't getting implemented quite the way I had wanted to get, you know, like following all the processes and creating all the folders and but it totally got into the DNA of the department. So that engineers were going to meetings and telling people, oh, we've got our complete street guidelines, because it was all integrated with the complete street guidelines and the clipping, and we've got urban infrastructure guidelines. And when they put out their big, you know, because governments put out these like big commodity contracts, right? And so that's like really complicated if you want to build all this green infrastructure. They just took the whole document and they said, this is part of our bid package. So all that stuff just got built into the bid. So it's stuff like that that can make a big difference, right? But I'm not gonna lie to you, it's a lot of work. And it's not sexy work. I have so many people who say to me, oh, you wrote complete street guidelines, write one for us. MDOT said to me, can you just do that while I'm working for the city, right? I'm like, first of all, that's like a whole other job. And I was like, second of all, I cannot do this by myself. It's not really about me. Sure, I can do all this good guidance. It's about understanding how you work. We have to change how you work, how you do business, which means that we have to understand how every one of your groups, divisions do work. And we have to look at that and say, where's the missing links? Where's the additional piece that needs to be? What's the additional thing you have to ask them to do or look at or report something back differently or that you're holding them accountable for? I used to always say that the question that a mayor asks of his directors can make a huge difference. So I did all this green stormwater infrastructure in Chicago, and our water department basically did none. And it was very unusual actually to have someone in the DOT do all that work and not in the water. Most other cities it's the other way around, and they're complaining. I'd go and talk to them, they'd be like, oh, those people in the DOT, they make it impossible for us to do anything. And I'd be like, well, those people in the water department, they make it impossible for me to do anything, which was backwards compared to a lot of other places. But the problem, of course, was even though we had a mayor at the time, Mayor Daley, who cared very deeply about this stuff, when he sat down with his director of the water department, he never asked that question, right? And so they got a lot on their plate, you know, I mean, you know, just, you know, 150 years of crumbling water infrastructure, just a little thing to deal with. So if nobody is gonna hold them accountable, then it's not surprising.
Would you comment a little more about the stormwater as a pedestrian or as a bicyclist? It's often one of my biggest issues that the drainage is set up where I'm going through puddles all the time and getting wet, and I don't have a car around me to keep me dry.
Right. Yeah. No, that's why that Cermak thing I'm so proud of, because the other streets were not, I mean, maybe some of them places the car couldn't even get through, but most of the time the car could get through. But for pedestrians and bicyclists, it was a total nightmare. I mean, basically. So yeah, I mean, well, that's a whole talk. So the problem is that for basically for millennium, we have been designing roads so that water is the enemy. You want to get water off a road as quickly as possible. That's how roads work. And the problem, of course, is that we have water, and we have nowadays in most places more and more water, although some places less and less. You know, most sewer systems in cities are designed for a 5-year event. That's it. Chicago's sewer system is designed for a 5-year event. As you can imagine, we have many events more than 5 years. In fact, not only that, but because the sewers are overwhelmed, they actually put in restrictors in the catch basin to use the street as a detention pond.
Yes.
Yeah.
They are specifically using the street. So here we have a street that hates water, And then you got a water department that's using the street. Now, of course, they're doing that because the other choice is people's basements. Okay, but so and of course that same project, the water department was like, we don't know why you're doing this. We have a sewer. What are you doing? Your overflow still into our sewer. And I was like, well, your sewer does not have enough capacity. So if I can double, triple, quadruple your capacity, especially during peak flow, I can store all that water you want to store in your street and maybe even more in a street that is actually more beautiful and will continue to be functional for everybody, right? Now, I also ended up taking, actually the water never made it to the sewer, but they were convinced that it would because I didn't have really good soils. And I'm like, that to me is like a huge win-win, right? But it's not the way they think of it. It's not, if you can't prove that you're actually detaining, they tend to be, like, what's the point in what you're doing? And I was like, the point is, I do not want all your water in my street. This infrastructure is going to be much more resilient. And it's making a much more beautiful place.
And I just want to, 3:30 is up,
Okay.
just so that Janet knows that she's off, but if you want to finish your question. Then
Yeah.
Thank you. I had to move the car because it got marked.
Oh.
So I was thinking of safety in numbers, but they don't build it. And then funding is through competitive grants. But my question is on marginal improvements achieved through active transportation are frequently not addressed because of the technology, the sexy autonomous vehicles and Uber and all those things. What do we do?
To get those other things addressed?
I mean, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't want to beat a dead horse, and I also don't want to oversimplify it. I mean, I do think it's getting to the shared values, and I don't want to underestimate that. Like, getting to shared values is not easy. That's a lot of hard work, right? And you have to engage people, and it may not exactly end up exactly where may not exactly align with your values 100%, right? So what does that look like? And that's a whole thing too, because it also gets into like what's the role of sort of education even in that process, and all sorts of things, gentrification. So I think that's part of it. And then I do think the other part is again, these tools, and these tools are not necessarily sexy. They can be pretty, I don't want to say mundane, because I don't know that they're mundane, but they can be very granular, I guess. Maybe that's the thing, right? Because when push comes to shove, it really does come to those things. I mean, there's a reason why, people in the complete streets hate the Green Book. It's because the Green Book is a tool that gets used all the time to bludgeon them into the ground. And it's a pretty mundane tool. And actually, if you dig back, and I don't mean mundane in a bad way, I mean, it's bread and butter, right? It's like, what do you do when you need to figure out the turning radius for a vehicle of this size, right? Well, how many times have I been told by folks that we cannot do something we really want to do that's really cool because we have to have this incredible turning radii? And it's like the idea that a truck might be able to turn into the oncoming lane, or not the oncoming lane, but the adjacent lane, right? And not go to use two lanes. Like, oh my God, that is like the end of the world. And you're sort of like, why is that the end of the world? It's because somebody sometime said that was the end of the world and put it in a book, and therefore it is now the end of the world. And it's like, does it have to be the end of the world? Is that more important? Do we value that truck turning into that lane more than we value what I'm going to get if I'm able to, add another 15 feet of pedestrian space?
And how fast does the truck need to make the turn?
Exactly.
also? Because sometimes
Exactly.
it's-
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, you can make this turn, but you gotta go 5 miles an hour. Okay, great. That's okay with me. That's a trade-off I'm willing to make, but that's a value judgment.
But some of those buses we used to take, the commute buses, some of them had to go over, so they used 2 lanes for certain turns on a regular basis, so.
Of course, given the craziness of cities, there's always places where that's happening. But
So,
if you have to design it that way, you will not design it that way, unless God country.
And the bus drivers would slow way down before they drove into the puddle.
Yeah.
So they
Because they have no
Oh,
choice.
splasher.
yeah, that was one of the things where the puddles were, where all the passing motor vehicles were splashing. I had on boots. The puddles didn't get me when I walked in them, but the motor vehicle splashes came up and went in the
Well,
tubs.
it's a terrible irony that our making all of our ADA ramps curb accessible has also created puddles at every single one of our curb ramps, which is right where we need to step.
Yeah.
Because, you know,
And where the people in
Great.
wheelchairs have to
Uh-huh.
go
No.
splashing through them. Yeah. Oh, wow, well, thank you. This
welcome.
was great.
thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm getting to where I'm ready to start writing letters to put the city and county on notice and make ADA complaints. Because I wear hearing aids, I'm not a disability.
No, the DMV told me I was disabled years ago because they had very poor sound system to call out the numbers, and I hadn't had ear surgery on one of my ears and stuff yet, and I didn't know when they called my number, and they said, oh, well, we have an ADA counter, disabled people can just walk right up.
You were like, oh,
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you
You
so
got
much.
a great question, by the way.
Oh,
People were
good.
really engaged.
I'm glad.
Yeah,
I hate it when you don't get questions.
I know. The students can be like that.
I know.
And your
We all can do
presentation
that.
was great, thank you.
Oh, thanks. I'm
Yeah.
really glad.
I was curious to know, okay, how it looks like street after 2020 or.
Yeah, and I lived in Detroit back when it was like really, I tell people it was like sort of like going to like an old western town that's been abandoned, but it was like a whole city.
Yeah.
Back in like 2000.
It's still, there's a lot of abandoned.
Yeah.
It's amazing how it's changed. I don't know if you've been there
I
recently.
went back once and like, maybe in 2010, and
Oh.
even that was like, whoa, there's like totally changed right in the downtown
You
area.
wouldn't
But now I hear
recognize
that
it.
I wouldn't recognize
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
If you haven't been there since 2010. It's Detroit's an interesting thing. I have a hard time explaining it to people because on the one hand, I don't want to at all downplay the amount of change because it's incredible. But on the other hand, I don't want to overstate it because there's still so far to go.
Yeah.
So it's both and.
Yeah.
But, you know, the big statistics that you don't hear people talk about as much is like that, you know, I think the unemployment went from 17 to 3 or 4%.
That's a huge change.
Yeah. And the poverty rate is more stubborn, but it's gone from 37 to 33%.
I mean, that's better. But
Yep. It's still, which goes to show you the problem is Detroit is, and this is because, and this is such a hard thing to talk about because it's, you have to really choose your words very carefully. Not surprisingly, given statistics around African Americans in this country, Detroit, of course, has a concentration of those problems. If you've got 80% African Americans and African Americans in this country have these types of
highest
issues.
poverty rates and
Right,
Chicago's
single
the
mothers, all that stuff,
But also,
incarceration.
there's a long, I mean, it's my impression, at least when I lived there, that a lot of folks there were really old too.
Yes,
So because they were sort of what was left when people were mobile and younger and things, they left when they could. So you had this sort of old population plus sort of a younger population that was pretty poverty stricken.
yes, yeah. You still have that a lot in African American community. Because a lot of the, you know, middle class African Americans are no different than middle class whites. Surprise, surprise. They all leave if they can and go right there. A lot of them are right outside of Detroit, but they're there because they want better
Better
schools, better, I mean, safety, I mean, you know,
Like, I love it when people are like, I'm like, does it matter what color your skin is? You kind of want these things.
Yeah, I always tell people like Detroit got hollowed out first by white flight, but then it was just white. Everybody who could leave left,
Right.
you know?
And so, you know, the problem, of course, is you have a lot of people that are in a chain of poverty and mostly, not exclusively, but a lot of single mothers. And they work, but their work is incredibly unsteady because their transportation and their childcare kills them every time. So they get a job and they can't stay in it because one thing, or health, those three things.
What about Chicago? Is that the same in terms of
It's-
African
it is-
American
It
population?
is to a certain extent, it's just that the problem is, while equally bad in certain areas, is it's still such a smaller scale in the total population than it
Chicago's
is.
such a big city and there's so many.
And there's wealth,
Detroit.
there is real wealth in Chicago, while there is, I mean, of course, there's some real wealth
But
in
not-
Detroit, but nothing like Chicago. So you can exist in Chicago and not see it at all.
But Detroit, there's no, at least when I lived there.
Yeah. No, even now, I mean,
don't know.
now you,
Strange place. It
I
is a
thought
very
it's
strange
just
place.
about
People
salary.
from other parts of the US, when I moved there, my family from the East Coast came, and one of my uncles actually was a developer in the New York area. He a real estate developer. He swore, he's like, I didn't think this existed. And my father lived
Third
in New
world country?
Orleans when Katrina happened. And my dad was always joked that New Orleans was kind of like he works in tropical medicine and public health. So he sort of says New Orleans is a little bit like some of the developing countries he works in with respect to the diseases that persist in the poor healthcare system. But I went and visited him right after Katrina because he stuck it out and things. Everyone was like, look at this devastation. And I kept thinking, like, I'm a little bit unable to see it as devastation after living in Detroit. Like, it just didn't look that bad relative to what a lot of Detroit looked like. And so even to most Americans, they cannot really, they like don't really understand.
well, the way we would talk about it in the city was that we had a man-made Katrina.
Exactly, yeah, and I actually,
That's what
I
Detroit,
said when I saw my dad. I was
Yeah.
like, it was a slower process in the sense, you know, that it was over the course of decades that it really hollowed out.
but it was very similar. It's just a man-made version. It was a man-made natural catastrophe.
I thought just Louisiana, Alabama, and those places, Atlanta, maybe
Oh, well,
those places have the big population of African American, but I didn't know about.
Atlanta is getting close where they may no longer be a majority minority city.
But it's not,
It's not really about that.
it's
In fact, it's not about
it's
it
not
at
really
all.
about whether the city is black or
Yeah.
not. I mean, Atlanta has a huge,
About-
vibrant.
But
Like-
about the cycle of the poverty and
Yeah,
I think in Louisiana it's the same.
Yeah, Louisiana definitely,
But it's
Louisiana also
not
has a lot of.
because, see, this is,
Yeah.
it's not that way because of Black people.
Yeah.
Because it is that way, you've ended up with poor people, no matter what color they are, really, and
Just in the US, there was a history of placing black populations in conditions where they were unable to succeed or
Yeah, and
to
it's a
leave.
cycle. I mean, it's a repeating cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's important not to be passive about it. It's not just a cycle that happens. There's also
right, it was actually a
social-
plan.
Yeah, it's actually
It was a plan,
yeah, and it still persists.
yes.
I went to college in North Carolina. I grew up in DC. DC when I was a kid was a mostly black city, and North Carolina has many like majority black towns and cities. And I thought I knew what racism looked like, right? Because I'd grown up in places where you saw racism, you heard it, everything. I didn't know anything until I arrived in Detroit.
Wow.
I was shocked about, I worked in the auto industry, the number of people that said outrageously racist things, that held outrageously racist beliefs, was much worse than in the US South, where historically we had slavery and things like that. It was mind-altering to understand how, like, it was really a huge cultural shift for me to understand what racism looked like in these northern cities that historically hadn't had formalized slavery and things like that. And it was like a really eye-opening, and Detroit was eye-opening too because of the historical context. Like when you went to like into Detroit and you talked to people, everything shifted. There were riots in 1968. People would talk to you about it like, well, before 1968, this place was great, and you're like, that was a long time ago, but also that was 30 or 40 years ago. It was like somehow even the history had been rewritten or redefined in this like very, I don't know.
The decline started to happen actually really late 40s, right at 1950, way before there were race riots. And everything that's happened starts from there. I mean, it sure, those things didn't help, but they are not the reason, and then, in the end, why it went bankrupt, there was no way Detroit could not go bankrupt after GM and Chrysler went bankrupt. If you understand the economy there at all, there was no way. Once those companies went bankrupt, it was a foregone conclusion that Detroit would go bankrupt. And think about this. The US government bailed out those car companies. It did not bail out the city of Detroit.
Yeah, that's right.
With a Black president. So it's
really
really important to remember that. Now, I am not going to sit here and tell you that even it's wrong or right, but it is really important that we acknowledge that as a country, we had no problem bailing out two major private companies, but we would not bail out the largest city that went bankrupt in this country.
And we let other cities flail when they went bankrupt too, smaller cities.
Yes.
So
it's values.
True. It's really
Values.
interesting to think about that, actually. I didn't think specifically about the bailout of the auto industry concurrent with the sort of bankruptcy of Detroit. So fascinating.
I mean, there's no way, you can't lose essentially your entire economic base.
And not go bankrupt.
And not go bankrupt.
And also have this huge city with infrastructure to serve a huge population, which is not there.
Right.
So you don't even have the population base to support.
Right.
The
Well, and then
marginal
that
classes.
population base, when they all lost their jobs,
Can't pay for it anyway.
well, not only can they not pay for it, they couldn't, there was no one to buy their homes.
Oh, yeah.
And they had to move to get jobs. There were literally no jobs. So people just had to walk away from their property. Literally just walk away from their property. They had no choice.
And in California, nobody can wrap their head around it. Because California, any,
Property always has
so
value.
expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, my mom's family has like land that you cannot build on in the mountains because they were gold miners. And it's still worth like $100,000. Like, how can this be worth anything? You can't even build a toilet. You don't have environmental rights to put in an outhouse. But land is so differently valued here, and there's such pressure for housing and things that I think it's really hard to remember that like there are places where when I moved out of Detroit, you could buy like a 10-bedroom home in the city for like $50,000 or $20,000.
Yeah.
It was the reason that you told you could
Small home swap.
Yeah,
That's a fantastic sort of innovation. You're this rare.
Yes,
This rare
imagine
place.
how can be I mean it's doable here in California.
Yeah.
And let me say, Mariam, I think you've done a really good job from not being from the U.S. and not having U.S. historical context to be really thoughtful about when you try to put those social indicators together. Because it's understanding history and culture is so hard, and we're all engineers, which doesn't help matters.
Yeah,
But I think it's really amazing that you really thoughtfully try to navigate all that.
First when Jen asked me, do you like sociology? And this is the one I told him, yeah, I like psychology, sociology, I like this stuff. But when I started, I thought, oh, it's totally different.
Yeah,
it's not because I'm from Iraq, it's totally different.
Exactly. Yeah, and so context is really hard. Yeah.